All right, welcome to Boosting Your Career, Strategies, Tools, and Training for Personal Growth. I need to find the next slide. We're very honored to have Carl Seidman here this morning. He is the founder of Seidman Financial, with a remarkable track record spanning over 2 decades in the field of FP&A. Carl stands as one of the industry's foremost public speakers. His expertise extend across financial planning and business storytelling and workplace engagement, to name a few. He's a sought-after speaker for companies, associations, and student groups alike. Drawing from his extensive background in FP&A and CFO development and training, as well as his expertise in executive and professional coaching, today he will be sharing his advice and insights on how to boost your FP&A career. So thank you, Carl, again, very much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, James.
Excellent. So just a very quick overview of FP&A strategy. If you don't know about FP&A strategy, we help companies accelerate their financial transformation. We've been around for since 2012, nearly 12 years, 13 years now. We really try and focus on process, people, and technology. And today we're going to talk a little bit about people, because people and training are key to being able to do financial transformations. We develop solutions that have impact in the financial community. And when we look at some of the research that we've been doing with Larissa and the FP&A Trends Group, we found that a lot of times FP&A are spending their time on low value activity. We try and reduce that as much as possible. We operate in the high-tech, food and beverage and retail industries. And our mission is really to leverage technology to combine strategy, business, and data to create an empowered finance organization. So I'm going to turn this off now. So today we're going to talk a little bit about careers and your extensive experience in working with companies and training individuals within companies and groups of FP&A teams. And so what are the things that you've seen that have worked with companies on training programs, especially in the FP&A space, and what have you learned?
Yeah, so what's interesting about FP&A is it's not taught in school. When you go into an undergraduate program or even an MBA, oftentimes corporate finance is taught in a very generic kind of a way, or perhaps more specifically to asset management or equity investing, but not really in FP&A. So it's not really taught in the university setting, which means that when companies hire FP&A analysts and they go to manager, director, and above, a lot of this education and development comes from on-the-job experience, whether that is experience through doing or through the peppering of training throughout somebody's career duration. What I've seen that has been successful, James, is not just teaching the skills of how to do the work, but also how to adjust people's thinking so that they can be a bit more along the lines of analytical thinkers, critical thinkers, strategic thinkers, so that they can understand the connections between what they are doing and how it ultimately connects into their function, their group, their business segment, and the company as a whole. So it's multi-directional, both in terms of skills development as well as some perhaps more holistic connection to the business.
No, that's great. So you've worked with companies. What do you think works? I mean, you've got all of your team that maybe don't have coming into the role, haven't necessarily had FP&A experience. What sort of training programs have you seen companies put in place that work, and probably which ones don't?
So one of the challenges that I encounter when I go into these companies, and I've worked with dozens and dozens of mid-size, small businesses and large public corporations. And one of the challenges that I see that these companies face is FP&A at this company over here in the retail segment may look completely different than FP&A over here in the healthcare segment. And so to be able to teach one set of skills to both groups, while you might have the pillars of consistency and overlap from one company to the next in FP&A, again, there's going to be some very different application of data, industrial focus, culture, functional structure. So when I go into companies and I teach them, it's not this linear pathway of you learn point A, B, C, D, and E. It's very modular, where we talk about business modeling best practices, data management, data flow and data process, data visualization, business storytelling and presentation, managing scenarios, sensitizing drivers or inputs, strategic thinking, being able to model without getting to answers without needing to model. So again, it's a very, very well-rounded application of skills development, thinking, application of the software that the company is using to get people to be a bit more efficient in the work that they're doing, and to ideally give them a whole lot more both confidence and confidence in terms of the direction of their career.
No, that's great. I mean, you talked about like quite a wide range of different skills. I mean, I think a lot of FP&A people have grown up in the coming through accounting, being in controllership roles, etc., and now going into FP&A. Where do you think, what do you think the biggest kind of jump from sort of that traditional accounting role to sort of the FP&A role? What do you think is the biggest challenge for the individual and how to learn to kind of add value to an organization?
Yeah, I think that that's huge. And it's a great question, James, in that when I've gone into CPA firms or outsourced controller firms, or even into mid-market companies where I'm working side by side with the CFO who actually comes from a controller background, one of the challenges is to get people to think a whole lot more critically within an environment of ambiguity. So where accountants may come from a world of rules-based process of there is a right way and there is a wrong way to do things, in finance, there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity and gray area, and knowing that a lot of our work is inherently wrong just because it's future focused. And so I think that part of the challenge is to get people to think outside of that yes or no, right or wrong answer, to say, this is mostly right. Over here, this is partially wrong, and this is why, and be able to defend those kinds of assumptions. If I were to spend time with you, James, and with one of your clients, and we're working together, admittedly, some of what we do is not going to be 100% buttoned up and right, but that's where I want to have the conversations with you of saying, James, this over here is where I'm very confident. But over here, this is where we are exposed and where there is some risk baked in, rather than saying we're right, we're wrong. It's understanding just where those risks may be. And those are the values of the conversations. That's oftentimes not what controllers and accounting people are used to. So it's a little bit of an adjustment in terms of thinking.
Yeah, no, that's definitely on the planning side. There is no right or wrong answer. It's just how much risk you put into it. So, that's a great way of kind of explaining it. I think it's, we do see a lot of accountants coming up through the ranks and, taking on those FP&A roles. Mm-hmm. We talk a little bit about, you mentioned kind of learning on the job. And, when I started out in my career, I heard that like 70% of the time or your education actually comes from learning on the job. What are you seeing companies do to be able to put in a sort of that on the job training and help individuals to kind of grow and learn?
So there's a lot of different avenues that companies are taking and that companies can take. As I think you recognize, James, is if that number is 70%, I'm actually surprised that it's that low. I would think that that's even higher than that. Thinking back to the early years of my career, I believe that I was in an environment whereby my firm supported personal and professional growth, putting yourself out there a little bit to identify what kinds of opportunities may exist. I remember early on, I had identified that there were broken processes, broken documentation, and I raised it to my partner, to my boss. And I said, this could be better. Can I take this on? And I think that in a culture of innovation and openness, most leaders would celebrate something like that rather than saying, James, I'm just hiring you to do the job, give your work product to me, and then I'm going to present it. I think that most organizations that are forward thinking and innovative are going to say, James, if you're a smart person and you see problems and opportunities, if you're willing to own those, I want to give this to you. In terms of ongoing development, where I have seen a big migration over the last probably 10 years, is historically there was a desire to say, let's just bring in a training program and let's just teach skills. So in the FP&A front, that might be, let's just teach Excel. Let's just teach, three-statement financial modeling. But the challenge with teaching Excel or three-statement financial modeling is it only goes so far, especially for somebody who's in FP&A. Excel might just be the tool. What you need to be teaching people is resourcefulness, not prescriptive solutions of you're going to come to this challenge and then you're just going to use this solution to address it. It's we're going to teach you resourcefulness of when you encounter a challenge, how do you create your own solution, your own product to be able to address that? What's also starting to happen, James, is that a lot of companies are starting to invest in longer term development. One of my clients I've worked on and off with for probably 6+ years at this point has one of the more robust financial leadership development programs, rotational programs. So while some companies may invest in people for a year or maybe 2 of rotations, this is a company that invests in their people for multiple years. They get to go into different groups of the business. They get to learn different skills, whereby by the time they finish this kind of a program, they end up finding themselves as a director of FP&A or as a junior CFO or a regional or departmental CFO, and the company has been behind them this entire time. So consistent with what FP&A is all about is understanding the business, not just understanding how to do the work, is it's longer term learning. It's more well-rounded learning. It's learning skills. It's learning the business. It's learning the institution. It's learning industry. It's learning leadership. It's learning communication. So historically of saying, yeah, we could have just invested in technical finance skills, it's going a whole lot more beyond that, and companies are more willing to invest in their people.
Yeah, I like your discussion about rotation. I think what sort of different roles do you think really kind of have an impact on going in? Looking at I'm a new finance person, come out of accounting. What are the sort of roles do you typically think that a person with those type of skills should kind of look at trying to do?
Well, from a background in accounting, and I hope that I didn't present this in a way that was, dismissive of that background, because I actually believe that people with accounting backgrounds are probably the best positioned to be successful in FP&A. The challenge is that oftentimes it's a very, very different type of thinking. The reason why I think accounting is one of the best foundations is you understand the ins and outs of transactions and reporting and how the numbers connect to each other. In the absence of that kind of background, it can sometimes be hard to be successful in FP&A. But for somebody to go from an accounting background or controller background to more of an FP&A background, it's thinking about what are the sort of questions that the business is seeking to answer, and how can you provide the answers to those questions? Or, spun a little bit differently, James, is what would we be able to do far more successfully if we had answers to certain questions that have not yet been asked? And so I'm always trying to think from the perspective, I come from a CPA background, but I also have an FP&A background. So when I go into a company, I say, all right, what kinds of answers, if we had the answers, would be tremendously valuable? What kind of data, if we had that data, would be tremendously valuable? Where are our risks? And what kind of analysis could we do to address those kinds of deficiencies? So it's a lot more proactive thinking of what don't we have that would be helpful for us to have, versus much more backwards looking, which is what a lot of accountants are used to doing.
Yeah, no, we from my experience in the past, that is definitely kind of one of the things. One of my experiences as well is going out and taking on different, working more with the sales team and understanding kind of the sales mechanism. I think that's sometimes an area that people don't always they feel, especially from an accounting background, probably want to shy away from, being in customer meetings, understanding kind of the to and fro of negotiation and things like that.
From your perspective, James, why do you think there is that resistance, or maybe a extent of discomfort between an accounting background who says, well, I'm not going to get involved in the other parts of the business, versus somebody in FP&A whose seemingly role it is to get involved in other parts of the business?
Yeah, no, I think it could be just comfort zone. I think that a lot of, growth comes from doing things that are outside of your comfort zone, so that you can, and being able to do that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go into sales, but I do think that, understanding and being part of a sales team, especially in a finance organization, and being able to, grow that experience and understand that experience is a very key part of understanding kind of the mechanism. Because I think too often that when I look at FP&A people, it's kind of they sitting on the other side of the fence and the other side of the desk, and they kind of, they questioning the sales team. Sometimes it's always good to be on, to understand and stand in the shoes of the sales team. Sometimes you have to be a little bit closer in there, and that's kind of my thinking of, a lot of that development comes from actually being part of, that different organizations, like the sales organizations, like the marketing organizations.
Yeah, and I think to your point, where I think there's a real distinction between a financial strategist, an FP&A person, and perhaps maybe more of a traditional accountant, is just that desire to understand various parts of the business, to get involved. Every consulting engagement that I've had over the last decade and a half, I've walked the floor. I've met the sales team. I've sat down with marketing. I've gotten to see the products in my hands. And so when you're actually able to see the connection between finance and sales, and finance and product, and finance and HR, I think it is not just much more meaningful, but it brings a whole lot more purpose to the work we're doing, and a whole lot more familiarity with the connections between finance and non-financial parts of the business.
No, it sounds good. So you talked a little bit about short-term training and the long-term training. I don't know if you can expand a little bit more. I mean, you mentioned, programs to kind of do rotations and things like that. When you see like a long-term program versus a short-term program, what are the other sort of benefits, and what are the other things that companies can think of while they're kind of, going from just a training program and then everybody forgets about it to something that's a bit more long-term?
Right. So there's a few points there that I think are very important. Is when you do something in a short burst, while it can be very provocative and provide great exposure and awareness in a very short amount of time, one of the points you just raised is, well, how do you make sure that people don't forget it? How do you make sure that it actually gets implemented? And the way that the brain works is, if you're going to overload people with 9 hours of a one-day training program, they're going to say, wow, there was so much that I covered there. I'm not really sure what to do to implement this. And then a week goes by, and they're back to the busyness of their everyday work. And they say, yeah, it was a great training program, but I didn't really transition anything that I learned into my business. In addition, one of the challenges of more short burst training is you end up focusing just on the specifics of certain techniques or certain domains. And it doesn't allow the connectivity from this domain to the next one to the next one. So based upon the way that the brain works, as well as the connectivity of a very large domain of finance, it's important to, I don't want to say stretch, but it's important to manage the flow of information and learning that somebody gets on the job, and start rolling it out over time. James, if I were to be in the president of a university, which I'm obviously not, but if I was in that position, I would probably advocate saying, could we have people enroll for 1 year, then they go work for a year, then they come back for a year, then they go work for a year, then they come back, and over the span of 8 years, they've gotten a 4-year degree. How I translate that over to training, specifically within FP&A, is, great, you've just learned Excel. Well, so what? you have to be able to apply it. And you have to be able to apply it in the unique circumstances that you are facing in your role at your company. And so the reason why I build the training programs the way that I do is I don't deliver right off the shelf. Is I have calls with the decision makers and even people within the team, and I say, what are you struggling with? What are your pain points? 6 months from now, if you were to look back on this experience, where is your team from there? So essentially what ends up happening is you end up building a development program and curriculum over time rather than just single burst of overwhelming content and information.
No, that's great. So if I'm a new leader, I've just adopted a new FP&A team. How would I go about kind of maybe even, how would I position sort of the short-term versus long-term kind of training to the company, and how have you seen it being successfully implemented?
So there are a couple of things. Is one, when you're hiring in new FP&A analysts, oftentimes the mandate is I need somebody to fill a role. I need somebody to be an effective doer. And so you're hiring for skills, for attitude, for perhaps a limited background, and saying, okay, how can I make sure that you are successful on the projects in the group that I need you to do? Whereas thereafter, and you say, okay, well, this is somebody who I want to be at the business for a long period of time. I need to invest in leadership. I need to invest in communication skills. I need to be able to invest in this person's mentorship ability. I need to give this person the resources that they need to be successful. So the contrast between somebody who is relatively new or young in their career is, I'm going to teach them the tools, the technical skills that they need to be successful in the next couple of years. But then thereafter, it's how do I get people to think a bit differently about their work, to be able to train other people in the technical skills, and to ultimately be in position of leadership so that when I step into that next opportunity, I'm going to be successful. One of the challenges that I often hear, James, is when I go into a company, I might be speaking with somebody with 15 years of experience, and they'll pull me aside and they'll say, Carl, I'm going to admit this to you. I actually don't understand why my CFO is asking me what they're asking me. And that's always trivial because this is somebody with a lot of experience who's not understanding the connection between what they're doing and the direction that the CFO is moving the company in. There's a really big difference between somebody with a decade and a half of experience and somebody with a year or two of experience. I don't really expect that from somebody who's relatively young. I do expect that from somebody who's a bit older. And part of that development comes from building an effective culture, building an effective process whereby people can be trained and development. And then there's a culture of mentorship and coaching as well.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. I like that. Training people to train sort of the next level down. I think that's a great philosophy for companies to kind of adopt. And, even individuals can definitely, start to think about how they can adopt that within their own companies, because I think, training in our minds is, in the consulting world is a continuous exercise, and we continually kind of wanting to improve and make a difference within companies. So it's kind of one of those key things. And, training the trainer is core to the success, because we can't, you can't train everybody.
Let me ask you a question, James. So in the companies that you're working with, do you find there to be a distinction between somebody who's a little bit newer, a little bit fresher, versus somebody who might be in a director of FP&A position? How would you say the expectations between an analyst and a director, or skills development between an analyst and director, are similar or different?
Yeah, I think, we see a lot of more experienced people probably, taking less time on the training side of things. I think that, there is an assumed knowledge, but I do think I like your point about, there's always, more stuff to learn. And, especially, one of the big things that we kind of, try and focus on from our own skill set is kind of more on the empathy side, trying to understand kind of what is, putting yourself in the shoes of the CFO, and trying to understand from his perspective why he why he needs what he needs and
Mhm.
trying to anticipate what he needs before he needs it.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of training or education that can happen within an organization, even at the director level. Whereas I think as a more junior person, there is an expectation of there is the openness to take on the new training and learn new skills. But
Mhm.
I do think that training and growth. And I think Hector just posted in LinkedIn just talking a little bit about growth mindset. I think that doesn't ever stop, and I think we from a education point of view, just continuing to learn, continuing to grow. And I think it does, in my mind, it does switch between the sort of the hard skills like you talked about, Excel training, to more of the soft skills like negotiating, dealing with ambiguity was a great one that you mentioned, and also kind of one of the big challenges obviously in any organization is managing up and expectations, and all of those are skills that get learned over time, and you're able to kind of develop and grow. But you mentioned it as well. It's the company culture that does make the difference. And I've been blessed with a number of companies that have been very cutting edge and trying to continue to develop teams. And I think that as long as that continues through companies we work with, I think it's great.
Yeah, and there's also something that you brought up, James, that just made me think is that, oftentimes when I do training and development at these companies, oftentimes people say, you must do business modeling every day, all day long. And what's interesting is taking a look at what I do. I hardly do any business modeling anymore. And to your point is the evolution of somebody's career from where that's what they're doing every single day for years. As you start to grow and you start to anticipate the needs of other people, and there's that culture of development and mentorship, you say, well, I'm going to start teaching and developing other people, more junior people, to be able to do the work that I once did. Because now I'm in the more of a liaison kind of a role of being able to translate what that kind of work product is to the directors or the CFOs or the PE firm or others outside of the business. It's that ability to think very, very critically, be far more anticipatory of what those third parties need, and be able to delegate and direct those responsibilities to perhaps more of the junior staff.
Yeah, I will say that there is a trade-off, because what I've seen in the past is people just generating lots and lots of content. So I will say that try and anticipate, but don't just throw everything at somebody, because it just becomes overwhelming. So
absolutely,
again, be critical.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about like company training programs, do you see like a big difference between like small and large companies?
Absolutely. That's actually a huge misnomer that a lot of people have, is to say, oh, FP&A is a one size fits all. I couldn't disagree more with that. When I go into large, let's say Fortune 100 companies, I may be working side by side with 30 FP&As who work within one single line item within the P&L, and that's what they've been doing for the last 15, 20 years. I remember speaking with a very sizable Fortune 500 company that most, if not every person on this call would recognize. And I, again, in these discovery types of calls, asking, what are you struggling with? What do you do? And what was most interesting is this company had spoken with an investment banker, and the investment banker was going to train them to forecast financial statements. And I said, well, how many of you in this group are actually forecasting financial statements? One guy. That's it. One guy in the entire FP&A team. So it's not to say that it's not important to understand and know how to do that, but in terms of what FP&As at big companies do, it's going to be a whole lot more segmented and very arguably much more specifically aligned with certain parts of the business or certain parts of the P&L. Whereas the contrast to that is FP&A at a $200 million company, $100 million company. You say, well, director of FP&A, what do you do? And they might say, well, what don't I do? So you're going to end up having, as you go downstream, FP&A takes on arguably much larger set of responsibilities, probably has more responsibility across many different dimensions of the business than somebody at a Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 company. So when some people say, Carl, I'm looking to get as much experience as I can. How can I learn as much as I can in FP&A? To say, look, if you want to get thrown into the fire and really learn all of these different connections across the business, smaller, mid-sized companies are a great place to be able to do that. The challenge is you might be the one building the FP&A team from the ground up because it might not have existed before you, which, depending on the personality of the person, that may be terrible, or that might be a whole lot of fun.
No, that's great advice. I think, it's kind of balancing off between those big companies and those large companies, and it's definitely different experience. But I do think kind of the rotations as well do help to give people kind of a broader view.
Now, what about from your perspective? I know that you work with companies of varying sizes, large, small, and mid-size. How would you differentiate between what FP&A looks like, both in terms of the function of how the function works in those different companies, as well as perhaps, if it's fair to ask, the caliber of the people?
Yeah, I think, again, we work, a lot of the companies we work with are typically large to sort of Fortune 100. So, the roles are, we do see that there are, FP&A, like some companies will have a single FP&A person. Other companies will have more, 100, like you say. I do think that there's a couple of core skills and core understanding that is critical. And I think, one of the areas that I do see is just the understanding of the strategy and how that relates into the business, because pretty much everything FP&A does is kind of planning and forecasting. But understanding the big picture, I think, is an area that probably is a little bit weak when it comes to understanding where the company's going, what are the kind of where do they want to be in 5 years time. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's very well articulated. Other times it's kind of hidden within the budgets and the long-term forecasts and things like that, as the strategy team get hold of it and push it down. Mm-hmm. But I do think that overall there's like a lot of common skills that need everybody across FP&A need to have. And then, to your point, there are sometimes very specific skills, but I would say it's more about an 80-20, like having that ability to do analytics, understand the business, understand where it's going and why it's important is critical. Being able to storytelling, understanding kind of, what's happening. Because I think that's the other thing is that I think, and this is kind of an area that I see as a lot of the challenge when we moving from a kind of traditional accounting role to an FP&A role. It's all about selling. Mm-hmm. You are trying to sell information to an organization, trying to influence the organization using data, whereas before you were providing data as a fact. It was like this is the answer. Whereas now we're in a completely different role in FP&A, and I think again, in a smaller role you probably have more access to that kind of influence, where you are providing CFOs with data, trying to describe a scenario or various, like a combination of scenarios, and being able to influence kind of a decision. Whereas in the sort of the bigger roles, you're just part of a bigger cog, but it's still ingrained in a lot of what we do.
Yeah, I think that those are really important points and very valid. And I think that you're right in perhaps correcting me a bit in that in some of the larger organizations, it's not that there isn't the kind of influence that there would be in mid-sized or smaller organizations. They're just larger enterprises to be able to make change as effectively and as quickly as possible, the way that perhaps a mid-sized or smaller company might be more feasible. What I also think is challenging in some of these smaller companies is you might be bringing in somebody to lead FP&A and there might be a lack of resource or a lack of team. So you had said you might be the only person within FP&A, and I think that that's often true. That there's perhaps a steeper learning curve, perhaps less resource, but then again, a lot more opportunity to be able to build something that might not exist yet.
Yeah. So while we're on that topic, we got one question from Arun, and please continue to add questions into the chat in the LinkedIn. Does the cross-functional department activities help FP&A analysts?
I absolutely agree with that. I think that if you have FP&A that is specifically located at the HQ or at the corporate level and is not spending as much time in the individual operating units. I think we talked about that a little bit earlier, is that you just don't get that kind of tangible connection to the business the way that you would otherwise, spending time with sales, with product development, with engineering, human resources, and elsewhere. So I think that getting entrenched within non-financial parts of the business is paramount. And then also for some of the larger enterprises with some of these financial leadership development programs, they're actually going through multiple months of rotations in functional units and business segments so that they get to learn what's going on in different parts of the business that they wouldn't have gotten to see otherwise. So I think that cross-training and cross-functional awareness is paramount.
Excellent. And another question from Jason. Do you think negotiating and influencing is a necessary skill in FP&A for FP&A professionals? And how do you suggest building these skills?
Yes, I do. I think to your point, James, is we're beyond the years of getting data and presenting data. We're now in the era where we have the data, we have the ability to interpret the data and to present it to people in a way that is both meaningful and influential. So, James, I'm not going to hire you to come to my company and just tell me what I already know through my financials. I want you to be an advisor. I want you to be a partner to me. So I think that some of that is, again, not just the skills, it's understanding the business. It's understanding the industry that we are in. It's understanding the problems that we're facing and the overall strategy. So if you are thinking of yourself, James, as an influencer of, I'm going to position this deliverable to Carl in the way that he needs to see it, that will build his confidence and his awareness in making these decisions, you build your own credibility. You build your own rapport. And so with credibility and rapport of delivering high quality insights, ultimately you become an influencer. And I think that that's paramount for FP&A.
No, that's great. I appreciate it. So just switching gears slightly. So recently it was announced that, let me just find it here, you were appointed a LinkedIn Learning Author for Excel for FP&A. Mm-hmm. So congratulations. Tell us a little bit about that and what's the program about?
Sure. So about a year ago, I had looked onto LinkedIn Learning and I typed in FP&A and financial planning and analysis. I didn't see a single course. And so as you and I have been in this field for a long time, I said, well, how is it possible that one of the largest, arguably one of the better, online learning platforms doesn't have anything on financial planning and analysis? At the same time, looking across the internet and saying, what is out there on FP&A? It's not a whole lot. And so when I was approached by LinkedIn Learning to build a course, I ultimately said, well, what are the two areas within FP&A that are probably the most interesting and the most currently valuable in the shortest amount of time? And it was, what is FP&A? What is FP&A tasked with? And the tool that is on just about everybody's machines is Excel. It's used by almost 1 billion people around the world. And so while Excel is not necessarily the best tool for all FP&A applications, as I'm sure that you would say as well, it is perhaps the best place to start to put together the forecasts and the analysis, to play in the sandbox, to manage the data, to put together the flow before starting to explore some other sorts of tools. And so through 2.5 hours of this very short but very intense and very valuable in a short period of time program, it's what's going on with FP&A. Why does Excel matter? Why does Excel maybe not matter as you grow? But how can you start to utilize the tool in very, very different types of ways than most people are accustomed to seeing? I teach dynamics. I teach flexibility for exactly the points that you raised, James, is if I'm going to be delivering again and again to different sorts of audiences and updating my data and updating my time periods, I'm going to be the influencer, not the presenter. And if I'm going to be somebody in a position of influence to articulate what's going on with this company to somebody like you, James, or to Jason, or to Hector or somebody else, I need to be able to craft my deliverable in the way that they need to hear it, not necessarily just the way that I want to present. So this course is intended to give people those types of skills very quick, very easy, that can make a huge amount of difference in a short amount of time.
No, that's great. I mean, from my experience, I do think that Excel is a wonderful tool. It has its place, not necessarily the only tool that you should be using, but it's a great solution. But you know, again, it comes down to the ability, the accessibility and availability.
Mm-hmm.
Created this matrix, and the idea of that is that it's available on your computer, so you don't have to go and get an IT or a PO to go and get it. But it's also, you can learn it pretty quickly. So I think that training program sounds great.
Yeah, I think that it's a great place to start, and I again would love to hear your perspective as we continue talking. Is at what point does it make sense to move away from Excel because it's not giving you the amount of juice out of the squeeze that you need.
Yeah,
It's a good place to start.
Yeah, that's always a great question. I'll answer very, very quickly. So, because there's lots of other good questions coming up, but I do find that I think that it depends on how you build your models. We've built Excel models, pretty advanced ones, and they connect to databases and they pull the data directly from databases, and it's very structured. I think the problem with Excel is that it is an unstructured environment, so it's prone to error. And I think that, the nice thing about some of the new solutions, especially the cloud solutions that are coming out, I do think that they are a bridge to kind of helping companies in a slightly more structured way. And instead of kind of getting into the traditional planning solutions. But, I think that, again, the biggest challenge there is always with FP&A, and especially kind of tools. We're getting onto tools now. It's always a challenge because FP&A is always evolving. Finance, I think, has been debits and credits for the last 100 years, and if you understand debits and credits, then you understand controllership to a degree. But FP&A, it follows the business, and it's constantly evolving, and we're constantly learning, and we're constantly changing. So tools that are able to adapt and constantly change with the current environment are critical, and being able to understand and be able to kind of manage those tools so that you can get the best out of them is also critical. So
yeah, I agree.
That's kind of my overview.
Yeah,
there is a question on the best tool for forecasting. So we're not going to go into that one in detail because that's a whole webinar's length. But I do think that so some of the research that we have done, we found that pretty much every company uses Excel in some shape or form. Some of them like 25%, some of them 100%, and really depends on the size of the company. So if you're using Excel, I wouldn't say that it's the worst thing, but I do think that you have to think of it and try and use it in a very structured way as opposed to unstructured.
Thoroughly agree.
Any other insights on the Excel before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, when I teach Excel, a lot of people think, I'm going to learn a bunch of tips and tricks and techniques. I don't teach tips and tricks and techniques and shortcuts and things like that. I teach process. So to your point, James, is how do I build a recurring process that is structured, connected to my data, so that when it's time to update it, I can do that very quickly and easily. Now, there is some robust functionality that we build on top of that. But I think to your point is from the years past of just building Excel models that are unstructured, that are very ad hoc and very manual. I think the speed and complexity at which we need to now move is now forcing Microsoft and others to have to rethink the way that we build models within Excel.
Yeah, no, a lot of good stuff, and there's a lot of new solutions out there that help with that. So that's great. Yeah, so we asked LinkedIn, we set out a survey, and the survey was really what skills are the most important skills in FP&A, and we gave a choice of financial modeling, analytical expertise, technical system experience, and business experience. What are your kind of thoughts on that question, and are we missing any, or what are your thoughts on kind of which of them?
I remember you posing that question, and I answered it the analytical skills. But I would maybe make a little bit of a disclaimer here and say, well, it very much depends on where you are in your career, what type of company you're in. So I think that you might have somebody who's a little bit younger in their career, and financial and business modeling is going to be where it's all at for them. Whereas when they get a little bit older and perhaps a little bit more experienced and overseeing a team, they're probably not going to be the ones doing the financial and business modeling. They're going to be overseeing the team that is. They're going to be the interpreters. They're going to be the influencers. So as you had mentioned earlier, is it important to influence? Yes, it is. In addition, some companies that I've been in, I talk Excel to some of them. They're like, yeah, I use Excel all day long, every day, every week, every month. And I talk to the person sitting next to them and they say, yeah, I don't use Excel at all. But what doesn't go away, regardless of what level you're at, is the ability to think, the ability to take a look at data, to take a look at forecasts, to take a look at dashboards and say, what does this mean? Not just what's it telling me, but what does it mean and what do we do with this? That takes a different type of psychology than I'm just going through data, I'm just plugging numbers in, I'm just modeling and I'm getting a result. So again, with the whole idea of what FP&A is all about and the connections beyond finance is being able to take a look at data and implications and say, who do I need to talk to? What additional information do I need? Where are we vulnerable? How do we alleviate some of these risks? I think that that's paramount. And then the last point on systems, I think that that's very important because a lot of this wouldn't be possible without the implementation of systems and technology. However, I don't know that that applies to a wide set of FP&A professionals. I think that there will be specialists who will focus more on the systems, but ultimately those systems are going to be touching and feeding most people, if not everybody, within the FP&A team and within the company. So I do think that they are all very important, but each one is important in its own way.
No, that's great. So just looking at, so again, referring to the 23 FP&A trend survey, and 45% of FP&A's time is spent on low value activities such as data collection and data validation. We also had another question about how do you avoid burnout? And I think this is kind of the balancing act that we often see in companies is how do you get and do and make time for training as well as kind of do your day job in FP&A, because often we've seen that FP&A can be people are working long hours, especially sort of during a close or during kind of a budgeting season.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make time to do the training?
Sure. So I'll lay it out very simply, and this is what I say to companies all the time. I was just in Minnesota at a Fortune 500 company last week, and I brought this up. I said, is what I am sharing with you, is this going to take you more time? Is this going to take more effort to do? And fairly unanimously, many of them said, yes, it's going to take us more time and more effort on the front end, but it's ultimately going to save so much time and frustration and error on the back end. And what I was sharing with them, again, was largely structure and process and technique of how to be able to manage your data, bring it into your business models, update it, and present it the way that you want. And I also asked, I said, is this really that hard? And they said, no, this isn't that hard. It just takes some time to develop the awareness, to build the structure up front so that ultimately it saves time on the back end. And James, from your perspective also, one of the big challenges, and I surveyed this company as well. I said, how much time do you think you're spending on data and getting the data teed up and on perhaps low value activities? And they said, well, probably at least 50%. And the CFO and the director of FP&A had said earlier in the morning, they said, we're doing implementations of new systems so that we're not all over the place. We can get the data that we want in the way that we want. So they're bought in too. The personal side is that when people can do their jobs effectively without wasting time and without having to drown in frustration, they end up loving their jobs more. They end up being far more checked in. They're more likely to be successful in their current role and in their future roles. So I don't want companies to think, oh, we have to address data just because we've got fractured data. We've got to address data because we've got fractured data, but it's also going to enable our people to do the work that we've hired them to do. They're going to be checked in and they're going to be successful in their roles and be able to proceed in the direction that they want to go in.
No, that's great. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's kind of one of the big challenges we see with companies, is that, you know, burnout and FP&A is kind of a thing, because, you know, people are just expected to kind of reinvent the wheel every cycle. So
Mm-hmm.
by standardizing that data and freeing up time, one of my previous roles, we actually did an exercise of kind of figuring out what to stop, what to improve, and what to continue. And I think that sometimes, part of the exercise of training is also to kind of look at all the other things that you're doing and decide, where are the priorities, and
Mm-hmm.
focus on the priorities. And I think
Yeah, you
training should.
can't do everything, and if you do everything, you deprioritize what's most important.
Yeah. So an interesting question has come up. Do you think training is going to change with with all the AI out there? And what sort of impact do you think that's going to have on sort of the roles that we do today?
I do very much. Obviously, we're in a very, very fast-moving technological world right now, where I think that AI is going to provide a very interesting training experience. Is one, a lot of the lower value tasks that you just raised, James, may be moot after a while, where AI will probably be able to do a lot of that. Where I'm perhaps concerned is that you might have some junior CFO or junior FP&A people whose brains will not develop in certain ways, perhaps critically, because they'll be able to rely upon AI to provide some of those answers. That's a concern that I have. But where I think the greatest opportunity may lie is not just addressing some of these lower value tasks, but also to create customized learning journeys for people. So, what may happen, James, is you or I may go into a company, take a digital assessment, and it says, James, your strengths are over here, but your weaknesses are over there. And the AI has an entire library of content and video and models that it can go through and say, James, I'm going to create a custom curriculum specifically for you based upon where your weaknesses are. Oh, but by the way, you're sitting next to Carl, whose strengths are your weaknesses and whose weaknesses are your strengths. And it will provide a custom curriculum for me based upon the data and the modeling and the videos that's unique to my experience, which is a little bit in contrast to yours.
Yeah, that's a great business opportunity. I like that. I think that again, leveraging that technology to kind of help people learn, I think is critical. We have one question about somebody that's in FinOps. He's a FinOps analyst and wants to transition to FP&A. What are the things that do you think that LinkedIn courses or ideas that can help kind of transition from kind of FinOps to FP&A?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm a big believer in learning and education and training. I don't think that anybody can go wrong by furthering themselves. Me personally, I don't learn as effectively from on-demand video training. I think that that's a great way to have knowledge transfer, but what's often lacking is the application. So, to the person who asked the question of how do you make the effective transition into FP&A through learning, you have to be able to get the knowledge, but perhaps more important is you have to be able to apply what you're learning. The reasons why I develop what I've developed is it's all live, it's all hands-on, it's all real life case examples, so that when somebody learns, they say, I understand how this applies in business, versus I just learned some techniques. In addition, what I encourage some people to do is to create their own, I don't want to say fake examples, but imaginary examples of saying, well, I have this online course that I just took. I can't really implement this at my company right now. Come up with your own business case, invent your own scenarios, and start building and applying that way.
No, that's great. So just we got a few more minutes left. I just wanted to kind of, you've just launched your CFO Mastermind training program. Do you want to give a little bit of information about the program, because I think a lot of people online would find that useful, and just kind of how it would fit for somebody that's looking for a career, not necessarily as a CFO, but just kind of expanding their knowledge.
Yeah, well, about a year ago, just given the requests that I'd been constantly getting of Carl, how do you do what you do? How did you build an advisory practice? How do you do fractional CFO work? About a year ago, I put out a fractional CFO power skills mastermind to address this, of saying, well, what is this business like? How do you develop your technical skills, your critical thinking skills, your analytical skills, and your influence skills? So ultimately, I've had, I think, around 60 people who have come through this mastermind live with me over the last year. But given that there is a significant amount of overlap between the people who want to do this work and the millions, perhaps tens of millions of companies around the world that don't need a full-time CFO, they need a really sharp person with a CFO or FP&A background who's able to work on a part-time or outsourced basis. So ultimately, the reason why this exists is just because of where the market is going, of more people wanting to get into this type of business, to be able to understand how to do business development and marketing and branding and engagement letters and scope of work, but also on the technical side of being able to think critically and analytically. And I've bridged that also over the last year. I've launched a bunch of live other technical training cohorts where a lot of these other fractional CFOs are saying, all right, I understand the business. How do I develop my skills too? So again, in the spirit of not just bursts of information, this is long-term experiential hands-on learning.
No, that's great. I think, a lot of people out there, especially kind of in the FP&A space, the ultimate, goal is to get to that CFO space. And I think this could be a kind of a stepping stone to try and get to understand kind of all of those skills.
And I highlight for people that you don't have to be a CFO or to have had a full-time CFO title to be an effective CFO advisor. You can be a great analytical and reliable partner, just having a finance or accounting background and being able to solve problems.
Excellent. No, I appreciate it. No, all of the stuff that you're putting out there is kind of, super helpful. And I think that really helps a lot of people. So any last thoughts that you have on the topic? Well, we've got a few more minutes left.
Yeah, so this is one of the fastest growing and in-demand fields in the FP&A world. And I would also say that it's perhaps one of the more underperforming in companies. And the reason why is there's just so much value that FP&A can create. And a lot of CFOs and even company leaders just say, look, I think that there's more that we can get out of our data, out of our finances, to be able to manage our risk more effectively. To be able to identify how much money we need to be raising in the next round. So for people who are in accounting who want to get into FP&A, it's a wonderful time to be in this field. For people who are in FP&A and want to take their careers to the next level, identify what the opportunities are, not just for you as a person, but in the company. Where are there gaps? Where are there deficiencies? Where are there opportunities? And if you're able to take a look at that and frame your request of your directors of your leadership and say, I see an opportunity or I see a problem. Can I own this? I can't see why any company would say no to that.
No, well, I really appreciate your time. And thanks very much for joining us. And if there's any more questions, we'll respond on LinkedIn. So really, everybody that's been watching, we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, everyone. Hopefully this was helpful to you.